Father's Day. We think of Father's Day as a celebration. Unfortunately, Father's Day actually began with a tragedy, or it's related to a tragedy. A man named Reverend Fletcher Golden died in a mining accident in West Virginia. More than 300 other men died that same day, many of them fathers. Reverend Golden's daughter, Grace Clayton, was mourning her father, and she got an idea. There were about 1,000 other children in that community mourning their fathers as well. And so she asked if their church would honor those fathers on a Sunday. That was in 1907, or rather in 1908, when the celebration took place. And across the continent, in Spokane, Washington, another woman wanted to remember her father. His name was Henry Jackson Smart, a Civil War soldier and a farmer who had raised 6 children as a single parent. His daughter was Sonora Dodd, and she began a campaign for Father's Day, not just to honor her father, but the fathers of the nation. She campaigned in her local community first, getting feedback and ideas from her fellow townspeople, from storekeepers, from people in organizations and government. And Washington State was the first state in the nation to celebrate Father's Day as we know it today. So just a little history on Father's Day. Today we give thanks for fathers, for father figures, and the spiritual qualities that we attribute to fathers. And I'm going to have to keep an eye on this. So what if we could manifest the best? Today we're going to explore a bit about fathers and that father energy, but also concepts like beingness in the spiritual realm. And because we can create, each of us can father the ideal or create the ideal. So we'll explore these questions. How do we honor fathers? How do we address our current challenges? And how do we create positive change? So I invite you to affirm with me. I use my spiritual abilities to create a world that works for all. Medgar Evers dreamed of an inclusive nation for his 3 children. He grew up in a Mississippi farm family, and during World War II, he served in the U.S. Army in both France and Germany. Returning back to the U.S., he attended college and married, and in 1954, Medgar Evers became the first field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi. Evers traveled around the state. He led demonstrations and boycotts of companies that discriminated, and he led demonstrations to integrate the University of Mississippi. Evers and his wife, Myrlie, received death threats, and they encountered violence, as many of the Civil War, the civil rights leaders would receive. The couple had to create a drill for their children, Rita and Daryl and Van. If you hear shots, drop to the floor and carefully crawl to the bathroom. Get in the tub. You'll be safe there. And one evening, while the family was still awake after watching a civil rights speech by President Kennedy, Evers pulled in the driveway, having come home from a meeting, and they heard a shot. The children crawled to the bathroom. and Evers staggered to the steps and then collapsed. He died at the hospital after they wavered about treating him. We tremble. We grieve stolen breath. And so today we honor not only fathers, we honor those fathers who have passed. We honor Medgar Evers and George Floyd. Fatal confrontations with black men must end. And we know that the horror is not healed. For me, in the last few weeks, I have struggled. We are seeing the response of deep collective pain and exasperation within the African American community and the world. And I'm grateful to all of you who have shared your concerns and your ideas. So today we are called to honor fathers. The Bible, a product of Middle Eastern fathers, often offers verses on respecting parents, not just once, but multiple times. Exodus 20 reads, "Honor your father and mother so that the days may be long in the land that the Lord has been giving, that the Lord is giving to you." And there are shared spiritual qualities of great fathers and grandfathers. You may think of encouragement, the act of inspiring with confidence. You may think of determination, a quality of being resolute, a steadiness of purpose. And fathers may have physical strength, but also spiritual courage. You know, the fathers of Scripture also held a tradition of social justice. The Hebrew prophets called on leaders and common people to act with compassion. From Isaiah, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. And Proverbs, speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. And the Christian scriptures, of course, continue that theme. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The Middle Eastern writers envisioned people as living images of the divine. So how do we address our current challenges? James Baldwin, an American writer and activist, was once asked, actually probably multiple times, about the progress of equality. And he once responded with this question: how much time do you want for your progress? How much time? It has been 401 years since a ship carrying African men and women landed at Port Comfort in the colony of Virginia. And rather than viewing those human beings as images of God, the kidnappers projected enmity. And you may be thinking, but we're done with that. We toppled slavery, desegregated education, extended voting rights, and even elected an African American president. And yet we can all look at the events of the past few weeks and understand that the roots and the systems of racism still exist. Many institutions still perpetuate racist actions, and the time for it to end is now. So you and I are called, I think, to take that energy of fathers, that masculine energy, to not only value the diversity that we see exemplified here in Hawaii, but to challenge injustices and foster an inclusive society. The world is changing because people are changing it. And today we can reimagine and take actions that lead to transformation, right? Here at Unity, that's what we're about, transformation. And you know, as we think about our own individual spiritual growth, we sometimes experience setbacks. When challenges occur, we may pause and say, but I already did this. And yet, we revisit similar issues only to go deeper, to look closer, and to grow in consciousness. Hermann Wiedemann, a German, was the father of 9 children. He first visited Hawaii on a whaling ship. And after moving to Oahu, he served as a legislator, a judge, and a cabinet member in the kingdom government. Wiedemann believed in educating his 7 daughters. One of those daughters was Wilhelmina Kekalau Kalani Nui Dowsett. And I want to thank Nina for sharing this information with me. Wilhelmina Dowsett protested the change here in Hawaii in 1900 that meant only men in Hawaii could vote. She organized the Women's Equal Suffrage Association of Hawaii, the first organization in the islands of its kind. Hawaii's women threatened businesses with boycotts. The women lobbied the territorial legislature, and they appealed to the U.S. Congress with petitions. 100 years ago, the U.S. states and its territories finally recognized the right of women to vote because of women like Wilhelmina Dowsett. The women activists of the early 20th century asked, "How long do you advise us to wait?" Votes for women began with that ideal of freedom in mind. And the rights of LGBTQ people began with an idea. And those ideas were shaped and formed. People in each of these movements took action with protests, with conversations, and with public processes. And I believe that we are not only called to individual responsibility, but to collective responsibility to make change. We are tasked to transform culture by expanding our consciousness, particularly our consciousness of compassion. And so today I believe that we honor fathers when we build on their ideals. Not that we do what they did, but we build on their ideals and those spiritual qualities. So how do you and I father the ideal? How do we manifest positive change? What is yours to do? What is mine to do? We see the creative process symbolically in the Trinity, in the Bible. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, being, ideal, and manifestation. It represents a process from mind to idea to expression. A divine mind is ever present, all-knowing mind, the absolute, the unlimited, omnipresent, all-wise, all-loving, all-powerful Spirit. And within the nature of Spirit is oneness, principle, substance, and a myriad of divine ideas. Spirit is all good, and people are created in the image of good. People of color are created with sacred worth. And so we can align our minds with this one mind. Light, as Kealoha indicated, represents the awakening as we commit ourselves totally to the power to move unseen good. In mind, we focus on divine ideas. We use our imagination with intention. In mind, we start ideas. We shape thoughts into mental images, images that bring color and variety and dimension. The divine power of imagination helps us to picture relationships, jobs, homes, and situations in alignment with spirit and our greatest good. And so, how do we apply these to the events of the past week? I've shared that I have felt shock and sadness. Many of society's problems or challenges, from violence, injustice, trauma, poverty, food insecurity, lack of health care, and unemployment, each of those has some link to systematic racism. It's a long list, and it's daunting. And I've come to realize that there is bigotry here in Hawaii, too. Recently, I listened to an African-American teen explain that he's been hurt by racial slurs from his peers right here on our island. What are the messages that Black boys, LGBTQ children, or girls get? They often hear damaging messages. Being a father, a parent, or an ally in our world requires a balance of compassion and confidence. Imagine girls learning to lead and boys respecting feelings and caring for others. We can each do the hard work of ending ignorance and oppression. I also want to share that I feel expectant and energized. Let's see if I can find the right slide here. So last week, Keith and I joined the Black Lives Matter protest in Hilo. Protesters, use their presence and their breath to speak up. Activists use their breath to make change. And I think that every sign represents a spiritual need and a desire. Think of all the ideas that are being generated and expressed. And remember that creative process, collectively and individually. It can feel uncomfortable, as it does. It can feel chaotic, as it does. And we have work to do, especially if we're not people of color. I've been reminded of that this week. And so I want to share with you some ideas. Educate yourself. Explore the unfamiliar. Place yourself in situations where you are in the visible minority. We can look within. We can strive to understand our own privilege and biases. Privilege does not mean that you haven't had to work hard or that you haven't experienced difficulties. It simply means that you will not face discrimination in the way that some Black Americans do every day. It isn't a contest. Listen to stories of individuals who've experienced prejudice. And we can each take authentic action. We can model gender and racial equality in our lives with practice. And we can talk candidly to children and others about race. We can think before we speak, and we can tell the truth. So how do we manifest? As we move from idea to reality, we are aligning with divine will, our highest good, and this directs us in what to do. It is our ability of choice, our power of discernment, and we practice listening to our intuition. The inner voice allows us the mental act of evaluation. And when based on spiritual insight, the voice is comforting and joy-filled, and it's free from prejudice and criticism. So I want to wander into what might be some of the outcomes of our current challenges. The future is being created. We see this happening all the time, but it's particularly powerful right now. We're all a part of that consciousness of change. We're all feeling it. So what will the future look like? People will continue renewing their own personal efforts and transformations with public forums and conversations. And this may be the most important part because it's the individual work of aligning with positive ideals. People will continue to challenge racial and gender stereotypes. People are stepping out from the shadows of silence. And communities will use protection, safeguarding, and preserving lives from injury or harm, regardless of the situation. We know it's possible for the police to use compassion. And we will see more emphasis on mental health and social work. Organizations will make dramatic changes in policies like all those that you've already seen in the past few weeks. So I want to ask you, will you help alter the current narrative? We recognize that at a spiritual level, humanity is one. But at an emotional level, we're far from realizing that. So how do we each act? Prayer works. Meditation calms. Compassion transforms. We do our internal work because bigotry and violence bury fear. We support and walk with the oppressed. We vote to change outcomes. We call for true justice that restores. We transform institutions of oppression into inclusive communities. Let us affirm together, I use my spiritual abilities to create a world that works for all. And we feel grateful for fathers, for father figures, and the amazing qualities of loving fathers. We build on the wisdom and the lessons of great fathers, and we use the creative process that we each have to reimagine a world that works for all. Because we are creative beings, we can each father the ideal. And so with Spirit's breath, we act. Namaste.